Hi, my name is Jan Gelkowski, and this is a podcast of a presentation regarding the future of energy in the state of Massachusetts. And I'm going to be talking about some of the big changes that are going to be happening to energy, not only in Massachusetts, but everywhere in a little bit, and its implications for people who, of course, purchase energy in residences and businesses. But I want to set a little context first. Originally, this presentation was supposed to be part of a panel discussion to be held in Dedham on Dedham TV, which was focused on the debate, the vigorous debate in Dedham regarding something called the West Roxbury Lateral and associated pipelines, which are being put in by Spectra Energy, itself being a part of Algonguin. So if you know what I'm talking about, I'm going to be switching here presentations for a second to a different one to show you what this is. Essentially, this is a project by Algonquin to bring gas from the New York area through Connecticut up into the greater Boston area. And the West Roxbury Lateral is this little thing over here. There are sections of this pipeline that go through Westwood, through the town of Dedham, and then West Roxbury. And this particular pipeline there's been a lot of opposition to it locally. Part of that is a safety concern. It passes by a quarry where there's active blasting and so forth. And even though transmission pipelines tend to be safe, it's not clear that Spectra has worked with the agencies in the various towns in a thorough way to make sure that all the particulars have been covered. They've done some of that, but recently, for whatever reason, they seem to be ignoring the local agencies, and particularly given the opposition to the pipeline in Dedham, which is also shared by the Dedham town government. This caused a fair amount of friction between Dedham. Indeed, the chairman of the Board of Selectmen in Dedham was arrested in a civil disobedience action trying to stop some excavation that Spectra had started on some pipeline. So that gives you an idea of how bad this was. Well, so there was a panel discussion tonight on Dedham TV that was supposed to address this, and I was invited to give this talk, which is a little bit different spin on the whole pipeline question. And unfortunately, technical difficulties made it impossible for me to do that. They basically could not get my slides in a form that could be projected on the television as well as in the studio audience. So there was no way that I could give the presentation without the slides, and so I opted to bow out, and instead I'm doing this podcast. So that's the information I'm going to be talking about actually is whether or not Massachusetts has a share of the zero carbon energy future. Now, this information is drawn from a number of sources. The principal source of this information is work done by Professor Tony Seba of Stanford University, who has written a lot about, he's a professor in the business school, a lecturer in the business school, and he's written a lot about disruption in various markets, what's called disruption, where an existing established business model is overturned by incoming new ideas. And so he talks about, for example, the disruption in the computing industry and with cameras and semiconductors and all kinds of things like that. I also draw on material from Mark Jacobson, who's a colleague at Stanford University, and he's written this report down here regarding how to move zero carbon energy out to all 50 states, what that would take. Incidentally, actor Mark Ruffalo is a big supporter of Mark Jacobson in terms of funds and things like that. In fact, Ruffalo was on the Daily Show, Jon Stewart's Daily Show, talking about this some time ago. Professor Seba has a book. There's another guy, Mark Shapiro, has a book called Carbon Shock. And the last source of this is Professor Richard Alley, who's from Penn State University, and he's a glaciologist and climate scientist. Now, because this was not done in a studio audience thing, there are actually some benefits to this. For one thing, I can take a lot more time talking about the slides than I had in the studio audience. There is the downside that I don't get to have the Q&A with the audience, which I was looking forward to. But if you have comments or questions, you can either send them to the comments section on YouTube where you find this video, or you can send them to my blog. There will be a blog post highlighting this video there, and I will include a link to the blog post, and there will be a place, of course, for comments on the blog post. I should talk about myself. I am a resident of the town of Westwood. That's how I got involved in this kind of thing. I am active in on environmental questions. Actually, I'm a statistician and quantitative engineer. I have 40 years of experience in industry involving computer software, nuclear power, and the internet. I've seen a lot of these disruptions happen. That said, I'm not an industry expert, nor a natural gas expert, nor a business expert. And like a lot of environmental activists, I'm self-taught in these matters. I'm a quick study, and you can think of me as just another citizen, although I've looked at these things in depth. Of course, anything I say, although I reference them to going back to these sources like Professor Sibo, I'm responsible for what I say. Okay, so first let's start out. Let's see an example of a disruption which happened in past history. This is a picture of New York City, Fifth Avenue, Easter. And if you look at this picture, one question you can ask is, where is the car? There actually is a car in this picture, but it's all horse-drawn carriages throughout New York City. And this was a time when horse-drawn vehicles were the way of getting around in places. It was also a time, incidentally, when most light was provided by burning of whale oil, and that was done because it had replaced things like paraffin and tallow, which were very smoky, and camphene, which was not smoky but tended to explode. And so these were superior technologies to the previous era. But if you fast forward 13 years to Fifth Avenue, Easter in New York City, you see that now there are no horses. And in fact, the road has been paved. And this is an example of a disruption, in this case in energy and transportation. And it only took 13 years to do this. And that's pretty remarkable. This is the era of petroleum, which was discovered, and they learned how to refine it and turn it into fuel for vehicles. And the significant point to take away from this is that this transition occurred. It wasn't because they ran out of whales, and it wasn't because they ran out of horses. There was a superior technology to the previous one, and it was cheaper and better in many respects, and that's why the transition happened. And that's a theme that I'm going to be talking about over and over in this talk, and why it's important for the state of Massachusetts. Okay, so let's get to it. Let's talk about electricity costs in the state of Massachusetts. This is our electric bill from May 2015. There's a distribution charge of 9 cents per kilowatt hour, a generation charge of 15 cents, and that's a total of 24 cents per kilowatt hour. It is what it is. It fluctuates up and down depending on all kinds of various things, but that's what it is. Now the question is, supposing there was a way of reducing this. Supposing that there was a way of, instead of paying for this energy at 24 cents per kilowatt hour, you could pay only 4 cents per kilowatt hour. But it has a constraint. It only works during the day, and it only works during the summer. And so the question is it worth switching? Well, that's a personal thing. It depends on the personal economy of the house. And it's not clear. But it is true that essentially, if you're doing it during the day, during the summer, it's like getting 4 cents per kilowatt hour for energy for a quarter of the year, essentially. And that's not bad. It's better than paying the 24 cents per kilowatt hour. And so it turns out that this is an option. And what we're talking about here is residential solar, which is not presently available, at least here, at 4 cents per kilowatt hour. But we're getting there, and we'll see that in a minute. But one of the things about the solar technology, and that I'm going to be talking a lot about, is that over time it improves. And in fact, associated with solar technology are a whole bunch of additional technologies, possibly local wind energy, possibly storage. And it will change. And instead of having it for 4 cents per kilowatt hour, you could change to a situation where it was now available both day and night in summer. Now, if you had not bought into this 4 cents per kilowatt hour as being beneficial for you when it was only available in the day in the summer. Now it's available day and night. Essentially what that means is you're getting 4 cents per kilowatt hour for half of the year. And now now this gets interesting, because now you're paying for a big chunk of the year, and it's a lot cheaper than 24 cents per kilowatt hour. And you very well may jump and want to do this and do that. Well, it's possible, of course, that the people who provide energy now, whether through natural gas or other means, could do their own thing and try to drop their prices to compete with this new energy source. But the point is, even if they drop their price by half, you still have a gap between 10 cents per kilowatt hour and 4 cents per kilowatt hour. And the 4 cents per kilowatt hour remains attractive. So let's look at this and see whether this is plausible or not. So as I said, we're talking about solar power here, and we're looking at it from a business perspective and not so much a zero carbon power source perspective. In this perspective, it's a way, if you get solar power for your house or your business, it's a way of riding what's called the technology cost curve. This is a cost curve which is attached to things like computers and cameras and mobile phones and smartphones, and it's in these electronic products that you see this characteristic where the cost goes down over time rather than going up or staying the same. Solar power globally presently is growing at a rate of 43% per year. What that means is that about every 2 years it doubles. And that means that the market share of solar in the world is growing bigger. That's because solar power equipment is dropping in price at 22% per year. And that's the panels and the circuits and everything else that's dropping in price, and that's why it's a very attractive proposition to go after that. As a result, this is going to make a big difference. I mean, as you grow in an energy source like that, it attracts a lot of interest in terms of investment, and it attracts a lot of additional innovation and technology. And it essentially results in these big economies of scale. So to give you some specific numbers backing this up, photovoltaic, which is PV, generation fell from 40 cents per kilowatt hour in 2005 to 9 cents in 2014. It's expected to be at 46 cents per kilowatt hour by 2025. That's conservative. It's someplace, depends where you are in the United States. It's someplace around 8 or 9, I think now. And it's expected to be at less than 2 cents per kilowatt hour by 2050, and that's by Fraunhofer ISE. But surprisingly, Austin Energy in Austin, Texas, bought photovoltaic power from SunEdison at 5 cents per kilowatt hour, just like in 2014. And in fact, Warren Buffett, like yesterday, just closed a deal where his solar generation essentially was producing power at about 3.6 cents per kilowatt hour already. So that's a suggestion that these rates for or estimates for PV generation are in fact conservative, and we may see this a lot sooner. The other thing that happens with products that are on the technology demand curve is that they're subject to rapid and continuous innovation. Almost anything that gets in the way of adoption of these, once the market share is big enough, gets just innovated around. So in Arizona, for example, the public utility doesn't like the fact that there's so much solar generation being put on residences. They have a lot of sun in Arizona, of course, and they're trying to change regulations to stop that. Well, the innovators basically are already, since air conditioning is a big chunk of everybody's power out there, they're basically innovating and finding ways of taking solar panels and using them to power air conditioning systems directly, and the grid has absolutely nothing to do with it. And where that is a big chunk of the power, and so that's how they're getting around it. The other thing that can happen when you have a lot of solar power is you can incentivize people to provide things like wind turbines, whose sole purpose is to support solar power. So you have co-located wind turbines or wind turbines nearby or wind turbines in a community. And the nice thing about wind turbines is that they generally provide power when the sun doesn't shine. Up here, the wind turbines have their biggest output in the wintertime when it's snowy and you have a lot of cloud cover and that kind of thing. So the term is they're anti-correlated with solar energy, and so they can work at nighttime too, and that's an attractive thing. The last point is that, of course, investing in solar photovoltaics in a house requires a fair amount of capital if you do it yourself, although all the major players, the Sungevities and the Solar Cities and everybody else have plans where you can lease the solar panels rather than have to put up the capital. Essentially, you're taking a loan out for them using the panels as collateral. But there are plans, certainly in California, to provide solar power for low-income people. And the Obama White House just proposed solar access for all Americans to do this. So there's innovation as well on the finance side as well as on the technology side. For those in the United States lucky enough to be near renewable energy cooperatives, and this is a map of energy cooperatives all over the United States, they can already take advantage of this. Essentially what these are is they're small community energy plants or facilities, and they can have solar panels in an array of some kind and wind turbines in an array, and the people in that region or that community draw their power from that collective little node of energy generation. And their state has a grid, but these people are essentially free of the grid. They're basically controlling their own destiny as far as power goes, and it's a good way to do things because you can buy power and buy equipment at a. Unfortunately, there are some states in the United States where this kind of thing is not permitted, where these cooperatives are in fact illegal. And Massachusetts is one of those states. Now, I have no idea precisely why this is the case. There is evidence in other states, such as in Arizona and in California, that public utilities will go to all kinds of lengths to try to get state governments to discourage either practices or facilities which compete with them in some serious way. In Arizona, they tried to change the calculation for homeowners who had solar systems, the calculation for energy costs for those homeowners in particular. And then in San Francisco, there was an attempt which failed. Not San Francisco, in California, there was an attempt which failed to essentially penalize people who had solar generation systems, and that was not passed. So I wanted to talk a little bit about why fossil fuels can't compete. And the basic problem is that fossil fuels have a large number of steps that they have to do in their supply chain, which renewable energy, particularly renewable energy that's local to where it's consumed, does not have. So for natural gas, for example, you have to extract the natural gas, you have to transport it, it has to be cleaned. The natural gas, when it comes out of the ground, has a bunch of hydrocarbons in it that clog up nozzles and things when it gets burned. Pipelines have to be constructed to deliver the natural gas. Sometimes the natural gas is stored underground, and when it gets to the place where it enters a distribution network, a special compound needs to be added to the natural gas to odorize it so that if there's a leak, people can tell that there's a leak. The natural gas as it comes out of the ground and after it's cleaned is odorless. It has to be burned to yield electricity, and then it has to be transmitted to substations and delivered to the customer. If you look at wind and residential solar PV, for example, a bunch of these steps are not needed. You don't need the extraction and so forth. Wind requires transmission to substations, as would commercial solar PV, and conceivably some community PV as well. But there are a bunch of steps that are not needed, and these all have to be paid for. There's a charge for doing all this, and so they have to recover these costs. And there is basically no way to get over the fact that you have to move natural gas from where it's extracted to where it needs to be burned. So that sets us up for talking about what I call the natural gas death spiral, and this is true of all fossil fuel energy sources. And this is why essentially fossil fuel energy over the coming decades is doomed, and it will be replaced by zero carbon energy, particularly solar PV. So you start out, you have given a set of fixed customers getting electricity from burning natural gas, say. And that, since natural gas is the interest here, we're focusing on natural gas, but of course this applies to other energy sources as well. So some find that residential solar PV gives them a cost benefit, and so they leave the natural gas pool, at least for some of their energy use, for residential PV. What this means is that the utility, and therefore the gas companies that they buy from, cannot collect revenue from the people that leave the utility grid, at least for that portion of the energy that they get from the solar PV. So pipeline gas companies, because they're now in competition, and utilities, generally speaking, have not been familiar with the idea of competition with anyone, since they're sort of like natural monopolies, they try to compete by sourcing more cheap energy of the cheapest kind that they can have control over. And this causes pipeline and gas companies and so forth to build more pipes and more generation capability. Well, that doesn't come free, because there's cost something to build these pipelines and utilities, and so that increases the price per kilowatt hour from natural gas with generated electricity that they charge. Indeed, if you look at the details of the West Roxbury Lateral and the Algonguin incremental market projects, you will find in there that they fully intend to recover the complete cost of those projects by increasing the rates per cubic foot of natural gas that they charge to the end customers, and therefore, and those guys are going to be passing that down to the ratepayers. At the same time, economies of scale and technology innovation drop costs of residential solar PV, either because the equipment costs are now cheaper to make because we have economies of scale and it's riding the technology demand curve, or because there are auxiliary technologies, related technologies that are developed alongside, such as residential storage. So what that does is the combination of increasing cost of natural gas generated electricity and the fact that the residential solar PV is cheaper, and also now with the additional technological innovations like storage is now more convenient to use. More people leave the grid for some portion of their electricity needs. What happens is that as this pool of customers goes down, the fixed plant and network costs exist, like a pipeline is a pipeline, and there's no shrinking it. And that means that the per customer cost of these facilities goes up because there are fewer customers to spread them over. And again, what that does is it drives the price up and incentivizes more people to abandon natural gas electricity for solar PV. And there are other technologies that are related that come on board. For example, there are these air heat pumps called ductless mini splits, which heat and cool cheaper than natural gas, and they're electric based. Particularly, they smooth out the spikes of price that it costs to cool a house in the summertime. We have these in our home, and we use them to replace oil in our house for heating, and that they derive from electricity. And so if you can pay for them with your solar PV installation, you're going to do that. And once you have these, they're off the natural gas. That incentivizes more people to abandon natural gas and electricity to solar PV, and that drives it even more. And again, the fixed plant and network costs go up on smaller customer base, meaning that the price per kilowatt hour of natural gas electricity goes up. Now, there are some things that you can imagine a utility might do for this. If this gets extreme, they could, for example, ask for cry wolf or pain or something, and ask for the state government to bail them out and use the taxpayer base to pay for some of this infrastructure. But that's extreme, and that clearly can only go on so far, because if they do, then it makes the state or the community or whatever less competitive to businesses and to residents. So I'm going to leave you here with two questions. First, pertaining to residential home values. And the question is essentially, what is the resale, what do you think the effect on the 20-year resale value of a home is? And there are three cases I'm asking you to consider. One is a $500,000 home, powered and heated entirely by fossil fuels like natural gas in Massachusetts. The case two is a $500,000 home powered and heated primarily by solar wind with battery storage in some place in Massachusetts that has that, like, say, Kingston or Hull, Massachusetts. And the third case is the same kind of a home powered entirely by wind, solar, and battery storage, perhaps in a cooperative, energy cooperative in some other state. And what will be the resale value? The things to consider, of course, is that if in fact your recurring cost for energy, which for even the richest of us runs about 9-10% of our total living costs, is much cheaper with the zero carbon energy than fossil fuels, what do you think it's going to do to the resale value of the prices? And even if the government in Massachusetts penalizes zero carbon energy, that of course puts houses at a disadvantage in price compared to houses in adjacent states, like New Hampshire, say. And the second question is basically the same idea pertaining to businesses. That is, energy costs and so forth are a significant cost of business. People who have server farms are interested in the cost of what it costs to power those servers, and to the degree that fossil fuels can't meet that value or that price, this affects their bottom line a lot. Some companies, in fact, particularly in the high-tech business, have customers who demand that they be sustainable. This is true at my employer, and if you read these companies' forward-looking plans, they plan to tighten up that sustainability criteria more and more, and at some point they're going to be expecting their supply chains to be 100% on renewables. And if you're not, you just can't compete for the business, and that's the thing. This is a criterion for being a part of their supply chain. Yes or no? There's no way around it. So you could potentially, if you don't have any zero carbon energy available to the level to convince these people, you may be losing their business. The second point is that high-tech companies in Massachusetts need skilled, smart young people to work for them. And increasingly, young people are demanding that sustainability be a major part of company practices, including the energy that they draw from to run their businesses. And so it's difficult in a future scenario to imagine being able to hire people to join your company if, in fact, you're not fully sustainable, including in the zero carbon energy business. Naturally, this compounds the problem of the cost. So the question is, I guess, basically, what do you think happens to the tax base, number of businesses, and employment in high technology in a city or state which does not proactively build zero carbon energy or has regulations which inhibit that? So that's it for the talk. I just wanted to point out a couple of things here. First of all, Massachusetts is often thought of as a blue state politically, and having a lot of progressive values, but the facts on the ground are, if you look at the amount of power that's generated in different sectors of the country, Massachusetts is actually pretty pathetic. I mean, in terms of zero carbon energy. In fact, there are a lot of states like Texas that really have built up this sector a lot. This is a picture on this slide of a shot of the Alamo 2 solar farm near San Antonio, which is adjacent to a bunch of homes, and they use sheep there, the gray sheep there, simply to keep the grass down and so that the grass doesn't shade the solar panels a lot or get into their mechanism. And it's a nice coexistence. And that is the formal end of the talk with that. There are some additional slides that I will comment on in a minute, but I also wanted to make an observation here that in a way, the fact that I did not present this talk in the context of the panel discussion on Dedham TV is kind of interesting, and it's sort of ironic because first of all, it let me talk about these slides a lot longer than the time that I had at the talk there, or at least I was told that I had at the talk there. And then secondly, so here we have Dedham TV, which basically has a studio and an audience and a bunch of TV cameras and things like that, and had difficulty dealing with these slides. Sure, they had audience interaction, which is something I do not have here at least until I get questions from the web. But at the same time, using high technology and just my computer and some software and stuff, I was able to record this podcast of the slides and put it out there for essentially anybody to see, which is nearly as good as being able to broadcast it on TV. And this is precisely an example of the kind of thing, of the technology demand curve that I'm talking about. That the price for this compared to setting up in a complete TV studio is tiny. And yet it has a lot of effectiveness to do this. So in some sense, it's a demonstration of the case I'm talking about. So as I said, that's it for the talk, but I'm going to move on here to some backup slides just to provide some comment, and since they're here. So this is that shot of New York City in Easter 1900, and just wanted to point out the car is there. I wanted to make a comment about installed wind capacity. This is from the U.S. National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and it shows the wind capacity across the thing. And you notice here's New England, 119, 440 for Maine, 171, Mass 109, Rhode Island 9, and so forth. Connecticut has virtually none. But if you contrast Texas, as I was talking about, that's a whopping amount of power. That's 14 gigawatts of power, and these are all in the megawatt range. Even compared to California, which you'd normally think would be the poster child for renewable energy, Texas dwarfs California by a factor of 2. So you can see that despite what you might think about Texas, they're basically taking this seriously. And the fact of the matter is they understand that in the future, people are going to want this type of energy because it's cheaper. And they know that cost curve. And apparently, their government stays out of the way. I'm going to focus in on a couple of places in Texas. Here in Texas, this is a U.S. Geological Survey shot from satellite, and they basically have a site where they map all the wind energy in the United States. And this is the location of the Gulf Wind Farm in Texas. It's right on the Gulf Coast, and all the wind farms, of course, are not that pinkish color. They've just identified where the individual turbines are in this picture. The port of Corpus Christi, Texas, has a very large wind farm that they use for generation. It's got hundreds of turbines, and this is on land. It's interesting that land-based turbines are much cheaper to erect than ocean turbines because they're easy to get to and maintain and so forth. The point of the Cape Wind project off Cape Cod was that it wouldn't be disrupting people because nobody would be next to it and hear them, and yet some people apparently found it unattractive to see these things as opposed to other types of energy sources. And I don't have any more comment about that, except that I think that's kind of silly. Speaking of offshore energy, here's another part of that Gulf Wind Farm in Kenedy, Texas. The orientation or the configuration of the wind turbines depends on the prevailing winds in the locale, and this is an unusual pattern. If you look at the Horn Rave wind farm in I believe it's Denmark, it doesn't look like this. It's much more of a lattice layout. Alamo 1, which is the sister wind farm in San Antonio to the Alamo 2 thing, is absolutely huge. This thing has over 100,000 solar panels in it. Here's another shot of Alamo 2 showing it adjacent to where the homes are. And lastly, for the natural gas death spiral or downward spiral, this is a feedback diagram, and I'm not going to step through this entirely, but this basically identifies all the components of the relationships between natural gas customers and residential solar customers and how they interact and where they reinforce. The particular thing to talk about here is you notice that in portions of the diagram where the residential solar and wind are involved, there are these loops that have pluses all along them. These are basically self-reinforcing structures within this feedback loop, and this is why this is the characteristic of the technology demand curve, that you have this, and you don't see that with the natural gas customers in this analysis. You see a lot of positive signs in reinforcing increased overhead per customer, and you see a lot of negative signs going on a number of natural gas customers. So thank you again for listening, and I hope this was useful, and I will be looking for questions both on the YouTube site and also on my blog site, where I post a lot of things like this. That blog site will be referenced. I'll probably put it in a comment on the YouTube site, but in case anybody's interested, the URL is hypergeometric.wordpress.com. Hypergeometric is spelled HYPERGEOMETRIC, and it's .wordpress.com. Thank you very much for listening.